What happens when the one person you gave your heart to shatters it? And years later, fate forces your paths to cross again. Michelle thought she had moved on, building a life of love and stability for her twin sons after being abandoned by Keith, the man she once trusted most. But when he reappears out of nowhere and discovers the truth about the children he never knew existed, everything changes. Can a father make up for 7 years of absence? Can a mother protect her boys from a powerful family bent on tearing them apart? This is a story of redemption, heartbreak, and the unshakable strength of a mother's love. As past mistakes collide with present realities, every decision carries life-changing stakes. Will they find healing, or will old wounds destroy their chance at a new beginning? Stay with us as we unravel a journey of second chances, family bonds, and the fight for what truly matters. You won't want to miss a single moment of this emotional roller coaster. Keith Warburton leaned against the cold frame of his office window, staring out at the sprawling estate that surrounded him. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall oaks, casting long shadows over the manicured gardens. Everything about the Warburton estate was curated to perfection, from the pristine stone pathways to the fountains that never stopped flowing. To the outside world, it was a dream, the life of a wealthy heir, the head of a vast business empire. But to Keith, it felt like a gilded cage. He traced a finger along the window pane, fogging it slightly with his breath. The quiet grandeur of the estate offered no solace, only a reminder of everything he had lost. His mind wandered to memories he could never seem to escape. The warm, unrestrained laugh of the woman he once loved, the way she used to light up even the coldest corners of his life. Michelle. 7 years had passed since he had walked away, and yet her name still carried weight in his chest, a heavy ache that refused to subside. At the time, he thought he was making the right decision, one that aligned with the Warburton name and its unyielding demands. His mother, Kimberly, had made it clear what was expected of him. A wife who couldn't provide an heir, she had said, was no wife at all. Kimberly had always been a force of nature, her words as sharp as the diamond necklaces she wore with pride. "You're the head of this family now," she had told him, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And the head of this family does not cling to weakness. You know what must be done." And so, he had done it. He had stood before Michelle, rehearsing the lie that would sever their bond forever. He had watched as her face crumpled, as her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Her voice, trembling with pain, still haunted him. "If you walk away from me, Keith, I don't think I'll ever forgive you." Keith closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the glass. He had never forgiven himself either. The door to his study opened, and Kimberly's familiar presence filled the room. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent her entire life wielding power like a weapon. Her diamond earrings caught the light as she stepped closer, a folder tucked neatly under one arm. "Keith," she said, her tone brisk, "the meeting with investors is scheduled for next week. I trust you're prepared to present the expansion plans." Keith turned away from the window, his expression carefully neutral. "I'll handle it," he replied, though the words felt hollow. Kimberly tilted her head, studying him with a critical eye. "You've been distracted lately," she said, her voice tinged with disapproval. "You need to focus. The Warburton name demands nothing less than excellence." Keith didn't respond. He didn't need to. Kimberly had never been interested in his feelings or his doubts. To her, emotions were weaknesses, distractions from the responsibilities that came with their legacy. As she exited the room, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor, Keith let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned back to the window, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. Later that evening, Keith found himself seated at his desk, a glass of bourbon untouched beside him. His gaze lingered on the corner of the room where an old box sat, its edges worn from years of neglect. He hesitated before opening it, his fingers brushing against the lid as though it might burn him. Inside were remnants of a life he had tried to leave behind. Photographs, letters, small mementos that once held meaning. One photograph caught his attention. It was from a trip he and Michelle had taken early in their relationship, her laughter frozen in time as the wind played with her hair. She had been so full of life, so full of love. Keith traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb, the ache in his chest tightening. He set the photograph down, his decision made. The next morning, he boarded a train to Chicago, seeking something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was closure, maybe it was redemption, or maybe it was simply the chance to feel something real again. The rhythmic hum of the train beneath him was a welcome distraction, lulling Keith into a rare moment of calm. As the city skyline came into view, a blend of anticipation and unease settled over him. Chicago was alive in a way the Warburton estate never could be. Its streets pulsed with energy, its people moved with purpose. Keith welcomed the anonymity it offered, a temporary escape from the crushing expectations of his life. He stepped off the train and into the bustling station, the sounds of the city enveloping him. The sharp tang of diesel mixed with the aroma of coffee from nearby kiosks. People rushed past him, their conversations blending into a symphony of urban life. Keith adjusted his tie, loosening it slightly as he stepped onto the street. Millennium Park had always been a favorite spot of his during business trips to Chicago. It offered a strange kind of peace amidst the chaos, a chance to sit and observe the world without being part of it. He made his way to a bench near the playground, the laughter of children ringing in the air. Keith leaned back, letting the sounds wash over him. His gaze drifted to the playground, where parents mingled and children climbed and ran with abandon. It was a scene so far removed from his own sterile upbringing that it almost felt foreign. Then, he saw her. At first, it was just a flash of movement. A woman crouched beside two young boys, her hair catching the sunlight as she adjusted one of their jackets. Something about her stance, her movements, tugged at the edges of his memory. He straightened, his breath catching as the realization hit him like a blow. Michelle. She stood, brushing her hands against her jeans as she watched the boys chase each other across the playground. Keith's gaze shifted to the children, and his chest tightened. They couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, their sandy brown hair and sharp features eerily familiar. Keith's heart pounded as he took in the scene. The boys' laughter filled the air, their energy infectious as they ran in circles around Michelle. One of them stumbled, and Michelle was there in an instant, her arms steadying him as she murmured words of comfort. Keith's mind raced. Could they be his? The thought both thrilled and terrified him. 7 years had passed since he had last seen Michelle, and he had never imagined she might have moved on, let alone started a family. But the resemblance was undeniable. He stood abruptly, unsure of what to do. Should he approach her, or should he turn and leave before she noticed him? The memories of their last meeting came rushing back, her tear-streaked face, her broken voice begging for an explanation he hadn't been brave enough to give. Before he could decide, Michelle glanced up. Her gaze scanned the park before landing on him. For a moment, she froze, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition. Her eyes narrowed, and her body tensed as though bracing for a fight. Keith swallowed hard, his feet rooted to the spot. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Michelle rose slowly, her posture protective as she stepped in front of the boys. Keith. Her voice was steady, but the edge in her tone was unmistakable. The space between them felt insurmountable, a chasm carved by years of silence and unspoken words. Keith took a tentative step forward, his heart pounding. Michelle, he began, his voice faltering. I didn't know. You didn't know what? Michelle cut him off, her words sharp and precise. That I would move on, that I'd build a life without you. Keith's gaze darted to the boys, who were watching curiously from behind her. His chest tightened as he whispered, Are they mine? Michelle stiffened, her hands trembling as they gripped her son's shoulders. That's none of your business. Her words struck like a slap, but Keith didn't back down. I deserve to know, he said, his voice steadier now. Michelle's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "You gave up that right a long time ago." She turned away, guiding her sons toward the cafe on the corner. Keith watched helplessly as the door closed behind them, leaving him standing alone in the park, the weight of his past decisions pressing down harder than ever. The bells above the cafe door jingled softly as Michelle guided her boys inside, her movements brisk and precise. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries wrapped around her like a shield, grounding her as she ushered Carl and Oliver toward their usual corner table. Her mind was racing, her heart still pounding from the confrontation at the park. Keith Warburton. The name alone stirred a whirlwind of emotions she had spent years suppressing: anger, heartbreak, and the faintest flicker of the love they once shared. "Mom." Oliver's voice broke through her thoughts as he tugged at her sleeve. "Who was that man?" Michelle knelt to his level, her hands resting on his small shoulders. "Just someone I used to know, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Don't worry about it, okay?" Carl, ever the more observant of the two, frowned. He looked at us weird, like he knew us. Michelle's stomach twisted, but she forced a smile. "Let's order your favorite muffins, huh? Double chocolate." The boys' faces lit up, and they scurried to the counter, leaving Michelle with a moment to collect herself. She leaned against the counter, her fingers gripping its edge. Her cafe was her sanctuary, a place she had built from the ground up after Keith walked away. It was where she found strength, where she learned to stand on her own. But now, even this space felt invaded. The door jingled again, and Michelle froze. She didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. The air seemed to shift, heavy with the weight of the past. She straightened her spine and turned slowly, her gaze locking with Keith's. He stood in the doorway, hesitant yet resolute, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. "Michelle," he began, his voice low and measured. "I just want to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she said sharply, her voice carrying across the room. Heads turned briefly, but Michelle didn't care. "You need to leave." Keith took a step forward, his eyes pleading. "Please, just 5 minutes." Michelle's fists clenched at her sides, her composure teetering on the edge. "5 minutes won't undo 7 years, Keith," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You don't get to show up now and demand anything." He flinched at her words, but held his ground. "I'm not here to demand anything. He glanced toward the boys, who were watching the exchange from their table. "I need to know the truth." "The truth." Michelle's voice rose, the frustration spilling over. "The truth is you left. You walked away and never looked back. You don't get to walk in here and act like you care now." Keith's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I made mistakes, Michelle. I know that. But I didn't know about them." He motioned toward Carl and Oliver, his voice breaking slightly. "Are they mine?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Michelle felt the weight of it pressing down on her, threatening to crush the walls she had so carefully built. She glanced at her sons, their innocent faces a stark reminder of the life she had fought to protect. "Even if they are," she said finally, her voice cold and distant, "it doesn't change anything. You weren't there. You don't get to be part of their lives now." Keith's expression darkened, the pain in his eyes giving way to determination. "I deserve to know them, Michelle. They deserve to know me." Michelle shook her head, her heart pounding. "They deserve stability. They deserve love. And I won't let you take that from them." Before Keith could respond, one of the baristas approached hesitantly, glancing between them. "Everything okay here, Michelle?" Michelle forced a tight smile. "Everything's fine, Caleb. Could you take the boys their muffins?" Caleb nodded, giving Keith a wary look before retreating to the counter. Michelle turned back to Keith, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Leave, now." Keith hesitated, his gaze lingering on her face, as if searching for a crack in her armor. But when he saw none, he nodded slowly and stepped back toward the door. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I'm not giving up." Michelle watched him leave, her chest heaving with the effort of holding herself together. As the door closed behind him, she let out a shaky breath and turned back to her boys, plastering on a smile she didn't feel. She had a life to protect, and she wouldn't let Keith, or anyone, tear it apart. Keith stepped out into the chilly Chicago afternoon, the sound of the cafe door closing behind him echoing in his mind. His heart was racing, his thoughts a jumbled mess. Michelle's words had cut deep, each one a reminder of the mistakes that had led him here. But amidst the pain, there was a spark of something else: determination. He walked aimlessly, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, until he found himself at the edge of a small park. Children played on swings and slides, their laughter carrying on the wind. It was a cruel contrast to the turmoil within him. He sank onto a bench, his head in his hands. "They're mine," he whispered to himself, the realization settling over him like a weight. There was no denying it. The boy's resemblance to him was uncanny. But more than that, he felt it in his gut, a connection he couldn't explain. They were his sons, and he had missed 7 years of their lives. The thought was unbearable. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he hadn't used in years. Andrew Gray, the private investigator who had once helped him with a business matter. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was Andrew. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Warburton, it's been a while." "Andrew," Keith said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I need your help." By the time Keith ended the call, he had a plan in motion. Andrew would look into Michelle's life, gathering information that could confirm what Keith already suspected. It wasn't ideal. He hated the idea of prying into her life, but he needed leverage if he was going to fight for his sons. Over the next few days, Keith immersed himself in meetings and obligations, but his mind was never far from Michelle and the boys. When Andrew's report finally arrived, Keith opened it with trembling hands, his heart pounding as he scanned the contents. There it was, Carl and Oliver Warburton, his sons. The confirmation sent a surge of conflicting emotions through him: relief, guilt, and a fierce protectiveness he hadn't expected. But the report also revealed something else. Michelle's life was far from easy. Her cafe, while successful, was barely scraping by. And then there was Andrew Collins, the man who seemed to be a constant presence in her life. Keith's jaw tightened. He had no right to feel jealous, but the thought of another man raising his sons made his blood boil. He had a lot to make up for, and he wouldn't let anything, or anyone, stand in his way. Keith's mother, Kimberly Warburton, had always believed in control over her wealth, her family, and her legacy. As she sat in the solarium of the Warburton estate, her sharp eyes scanned the private investigator's report spread across the table before her. The sunlight streaming through the glass ceiling illuminated her cold expression as she absorbed every detail of the file. "Twin boys," she murmured, her manicured fingers tracing a photograph of Carl and Oliver. Their resemblance to Keith was undeniable, and Kimberly felt a surge of anger, not at Keith, but at Michelle. The woman had dared to keep Warburton heirs away from their rightful place. She closed the folder and pressed the intercom button on the side of her chair. "James, bring me Keith. Now." Minutes later, Keith entered the room, his posture tense. Kimberly didn't bother with pleasantries. She held up the report, her expression icy. "When were you going to tell me?" Keith froze, his gaze flickering to the folder in her hands. "Tell you what. Don't play coy with me, Keith," Kimberly snapped. "Those boys are Warburtons, and you've been hiding them from me." Keith's jaw clenched, and he took a slow, steadying breath. "I wasn't hiding anything. I only found out about them myself." Kimberly's eyes narrowed. "And you didn't think it was important enough to bring to my attention? Do you realize what this means for our family?" Keith's patience was wearing thin. "They're not pawns in your game, Mother. They're my sons. They're heirs," Kimberly corrected, her voice steely. "And they belong here, with us." Keith shook his head. "No, they belong with their mother. Michelle's raised them on her own for 7 years. I'm not going to rip them away from her. Kimberly's laugh was sharp and humorless. Don't be naive, Keith. That woman kept them from you, from us. She's already proven she can't be trusted. She kept them from me because I left her, Keith shot back, his voice rising. This is my fault, not hers. Kimberly's expression hardened. Fault or not, those boys are Warburtons, and they deserve the best this family can offer. If Michelle won't cooperate, we'll make her. Keith's blood ran cold. What does that mean? It means I'll do whatever it takes to secure their future, Kimberly said, her tone leaving no room for argument. And if you won't act, I will. Keith stared at her, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. He knew Kimberly's methods all too well. She would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. And now, she wanted Carl and Oliver. Michelle was on edge as she prepared the cafe for the day. The morning rush was just beginning, but her thoughts were miles away, replaying her confrontation with Keith and the weight of his unspoken intentions. She had worked too hard to create a stable life for her boys, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially Keith, disrupt it. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Keith standing there, his expression uncertain but determined. He held a small bag in his hand, and for a moment, Michelle felt a pang of irritation. She wasn't in the mood for whatever gesture he thought might smooth things over. "What do you want, Keith?" she asked, her voice cool as she wiped down the counter. "I want to see them," he said simply, stepping closer. "Please, just for a little while." Michelle hesitated, her protective instincts flaring, but she saw something in his eyes, a sincerity she hadn't expected. She sighed, glancing toward the back of the cafe where her boys were playing quietly. "Fine, but I'm watching." Keith nodded, relief washing over his face. "Thank you." Carl and Oliver looked up as Keith approached, their curious eyes studying him. Keith crouched to their level, his heart pounding as he tried to find the right words. "Hi," he said softly, offering a tentative smile. "I'm Keith. I'm a friend of your mom's." Carl tilted his head, his expression skeptical. "You're the man from the park." Keith's smile faltered, but he nodded. "That's right. I saw you there." Oliver, the more outgoing of the two, leaned closer. "Why were you looking at us?" Keith glanced at Michelle, who was watching from behind the counter, her arms crossed. He turned back to the boys, choosing his words carefully. "Because you reminded me of someone I used to know, someone very special." The boys exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued. Keith reached into the bag he was holding and pulled out 2 small toy cars. "I thought you might like these," he said, holding them out. Carl hesitated, but Oliver's face lit up as he took one of the cars, turning it over in his hands. "Cool," he exclaimed, rolling it across the table. Carl eventually took the other car, though his gaze remained wary. "Thanks," he mumbled. Keith smiled, a warmth spreading through him as he watched the boys. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. But when he glanced at Michelle, her expression was unreadable. The visit was brief, but it was enough to deepen Keith's resolve. He wouldn't give up, not on his sons and not on the chance to make things right. The Warburton estate sat shrouded in the muted light of early evening as Kimberly Warburton paced the length of the library. Her heels clicked against the polished wooden floors, a sound that had always signaled the arrival of her steely resolve. The confrontation with Keith earlier in the day lingered in her mind. He was resisting her. Her own son, the heir to their family legacy, was turning soft, blinded by sentimentality and guilt. It was a weakness she wouldn't tolerate. She stopped in front of a grand oak desk, running her hand over the envelope that contained another copy of the private investigator's report. Every detail of Michelle's life was there: her struggling finances, her modest cafe, her support network. Kimberly had paid for thorough work, and the information painted a picture of a woman who was no match for the Warburton name. Mrs. Warburton. James, her loyal assistant, appeared in the doorway, his voice low. "What is it?" Kimberly asked without looking up. "The attorneys have confirmed that we can pursue a case for custody of the boys based on Michelle's financial instability," he said. "If necessary, We can argue that the Warburton family offers a more secure future for them. Kimberly allowed herself a satisfied smile. It was the answer she had been hoping for. Good, she said, her tone cold. Begin the paperwork. I want everything in motion by the end of the week. James hesitated. And Keith, ma'am, how do you want to handle him? Kimberly's expression hardened. Keith will come around. He always does. And if he doesn't, she left the thought unfinished, her meaning clear. Meanwhile, Keith sat in his penthouse apartment, staring at the folder Andrew had sent him. Inside were copies of the same documents Kimberly now held. Financial reports from Michelle's cafe, details about her modest home, and even photographs of Carl and Oliver. But where Kimberly saw leverage, Keith saw a life Michelle had built on her own, a life he had no right to disrupt. The phone on his desk buzzed, and Keith's stomach sank when he saw his mother's name flashing on the screen. He answered reluctantly. "Mother," he said, his tone guarded. "Keith, I hope you've had time to reconsider your stance," Kimberly said, her voice sharp. "Those boys are Warburtons. They belong here, with us. They belong with their mother," Keith said firmly. Kimberly's tone turned icy. "Don't be foolish. Michelle can't offer them what we can: security, opportunity, a future. If you won't act in their best interest, I will." Keith gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "If you go after her, you'll regret it." There was a pause on the line before Kimberly replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "You've grown soft, Keith. That woman has clouded your judgment. But I'll do what needs to be done, with or without your approval." The line went dead, leaving Keith seething. He knew Kimberly's threats weren't empty. If he didn't act quickly, she would bulldoze through Michelle's life without hesitation. The next morning, Michelle awoke to the sound of her alarm clock and the faint hum of life outside her window. The cafe would be opening soon, and as much as she wanted to focus on the day ahead, her thoughts were consumed by Keith's unexpected visit and the implications of his return. She glanced toward the small dining table in her apartment, where Carl and Oliver were finishing their breakfast. "Eat up, boys," she said, forcing a cheerful tone. "We've got a busy day ahead. Is that man coming back?" Oliver asked, his wide eyes betraying his curiosity. Michelle paused, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. "What man?" "The one who gave us the cars," Oliver said. Carl frowned. "He's weird." "Carl," Michelle said gently, setting her mug down. "That man is someone I used to know a long time ago. But he's not part of our lives, okay?" The boys nodded, but Michelle could see the questions lingering in their minds. She pushed the thought aside as she ushered them out the door and into the bustling world of the cafe. By mid-morning, the cafe was alive with the usual crowd of regulars and new customers. Michelle had just finished preparing an order when the bell above the door jingled. She turned, her heart sinking as Keith walked in. He looked different today, less polished, almost hesitant. He approached the counter with careful steps, his hands in his pockets. "Morning," he said softly. Michelle didn't respond, her gaze narrowing. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see if I could help," Keith said, motioning toward the bustling cafe. "You've got your hands full." Michelle crossed her arms. "I don't need your help." "Maybe not," Keith said, "but I'm here anyway." Before Michelle could argue, one of her regulars called out for a refill, and she turned away, muttering under her breath. Keith, undeterred, stepped behind the counter, grabbing an apron from a nearby hook. "What are you doing?" Michelle demanded, her voice low. "Helping," Keith said simply. For the next hour, Keith busied himself taking orders, delivering plates, and cleaning tables. Michelle couldn't decide whether to be annoyed or impressed. The customers seemed to like him, and for a man who had probably never worked a day in food service, he adapted quickly. By the time the lunch rush died down, Michelle was exhausted. She leaned against the counter, watching as Keith wiped down the tables. When he finally approached her, his expression was unreadable. "Thanks for letting me stay," he said quietly. "I didn't," Michelle shot back, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. Keith hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see you around." As he walked out, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed walls were starting to crack. The cafe was unusually quiet that evening as Michelle cleaned up after a long day. The hum of the espresso machine, usually comforting, did little to ease the growing tension in her chest. She glanced at Carl and Oliver, who were seated at a corner table drawing in their notebooks, their cheerful chatter a rare reprieve from the chaos Keith's sudden reappearance had caused. The ringing of her phone shattered the silence. Michelle wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up from the counter. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but something about it made her stomach twist. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Michelle Jones." The voice on the other end was formal and clipped, sending a shiver down her spine. "Yes, this is she. This is Mark Townsend, legal counsel for Kimberly Warburton. I'm calling to inform you that the Warburton family has filed a petition for joint custody of Carl and Oliver Warburton, citing concerns regarding their current living conditions." Michelle felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" The petition states that the Warburton family can provide a more stable and financially secure environment for the children, Townsend continued, his tone devoid of emotion. "You should be receiving the official documents in the coming days. I suggest you consult an attorney." Michelle's hand trembled as she gripped the phone. "This is ridiculous. My sons are happy, and they're safe. You can't just take them away from me." "I'm merely the messenger, Miss Jones," Townsend replied coolly. "Good evening." The call ended, leaving Michelle standing in stunned silence. Her mind raced, panic gripping her chest as the implications of Kimberly's actions sank in. She had worked tirelessly to give her boys a stable, loving home. How dare Kimberly claim otherwise? She turned to her sons, their innocent faces blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. For a moment, her resolve wavered, but then a fierce determination took hold. Kimberly Warburton would not take her children. The next morning, Michelle sat across from her attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Laura Bennett. Laura's sharp eyes scanned the documents spread out on the desk, her expression growing darker with each passing minute. "This is aggressive," Laura said finally, looking up at Michelle. "They're not just asking for joint custody. They're implying you're unfit to be their primary caregiver." Michelle's jaw tightened. "Unfit? I've raised those boys on my own for 7 years. They're healthy, happy, and love." "I believe you," Laura said, her tone calm but firm. "But Kimberly Warburton is a powerful woman, and she knows how to manipulate the system. She'll use your finances, your lack of connections, and anything else she can find against you." Michelle's heart sank. "What can we do?" "We fight," Laura said simply. "But you need to be prepared for a battle. This won't be easy." Michelle nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes." Keith stood outside the cafe, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. He knew Michelle was furious with him, but after the call he'd received from Kimberly's lawyer, he couldn't stay silent. He had to warn her. When Michelle opened the door and saw him, her expression hardened. "What do you want? Can we talk?" Keith asked, his tone earnest. "I don't have time for this," she snapped, but he stepped inside before she could shut the door in his face. "This isn't about me," Keith said quickly. "It's about my mother. She's going after you in court, Michelle." Michelle froze, her eyes narrowing. "I know. I got the call last night." Keith sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry. I had no idea she'd go this far, didn't you?" Michelle shot back, her voice laced with anger. "This is exactly the kind of thing she would do, and you didn't stop her." Keith flinched at the accusation, but held his ground. "I'm trying to stop her now. I'll testify for you in court if I have to." Michelle stared at him, her anger mingling with disbelief. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Keith said simply. "And because I want to prove to you that I'm not the same man who walked away 7 years ago." Michelle's gaze softened slightly, but she quickly masked it. "I don't need your help, Keith. I've been doing this on my own, and I'll keep doing it on my own." Keith stepped closer, his voice steady. "You don't have to do it alone, Michelle. Let me help you." "For them." Michelle hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the boys, who were playing in the back room. She wanted to protect them, to shield them from the chaos of the Warburton family. But a small part of her wondered if Keith might actually mean what he said. "Fine," she said finally, her voice low. "But if you mess this up, if you do anything to hurt them, I swear I'll make you regret it." Keith nodded, his expression serious. "I won't let you down." As he left the cafe, Michelle felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She didn't trust Keith completely, but for now, she had no choice but to accept his help. The fight for her sons had only just begun. The day of the preliminary custody hearing arrived faster than Michelle had anticipated. She stood outside the courthouse, gripping the handle of her purse tightly, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. The looming building seemed colder than usual, its gray facade a stark reminder of the fight she was about to face. "Mom." Carl's small voice pulled her from her thoughts. He and Oliver were standing beside her, both dressed neatly in matching button-down shirts and slacks. Michelle crouched down, brushing Carl's hair back gently. "It's going to be okay," she said, forcing a smile. "We're just here to talk to some people, and then we'll go for ice cream after. How does that sound?" Oliver grinned. "Can we get the big sundae with the sprinkles?" Michelle nodded, her throat tightening. "Of course." She stood as Laura Bennett approached, her sharp heels clicking against the pavement. The lawyer's confident demeanor gave Michelle a flicker of reassurance. "Ready?" Laura asked, glancing at the boys. Michelle took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Kimberly Warburton sat at the plaintiff's table, her polished appearance and icy glare exuding confidence. Beside her, her legal team shuffled through papers, their expensive suits and composed expressions signaling their preparedness. Michelle sat at the defendant's table with Laura and Keith, who had insisted on being present despite Michelle's initial protests. His presence added an unexpected layer of tension. As the proceedings began, Kimberly's attorney rose to speak, painting a picture of a struggling single mother unable to provide the stability and opportunities that the Warburton family could offer. Michelle clenched her fists under the table, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. When it was Laura's turn, she stood with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, Michelle Jones has been the sole caregiver for Carl and Oliver since their birth. She has provided a loving and nurturing home, despite immense challenges. Stability is not defined by wealth, and my client has done everything to ensure her sons are happy and healthy." The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Keith took the stand as a witness, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Warburton," Laura began, "you are the biological father of Carl and Oliver. Why have you chosen to support Michelle Jones in this matter?" Keith's gaze flickered to Michelle before he answered. "Because she's the one who raised them. She's the one who's been there for them every single day. I might have the resources to offer them more materially, but Michelle has given them everything that truly matters." Kimberly's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Keith ignored her. He continued, his voice steady. "I made mistakes, but I won't let my mother's actions hurt my sons or the woman who sacrificed so much for them." Michelle stared at him, her emotions a mix of surprise and gratitude. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Michelle's relief after the hearing was short-lived. That evening, as she closed the cafe, Andrew arrived unannounced, his expression tense. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, and waited for her to speak. "Andrew," Michelle said softly, setting a tray of mugs aside. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk," he said, his voice clipped. Michelle sighed, wiping her hands on a towel. "Let me guess. This is about Keith." Andrew nodded, his gaze unwavering. "It's about everything, Michelle. Him showing up, the custody battle, the fact that you let him testify today." He insisted, Michelle said, her tone defensive. "And you didn't push back?" Andrew asked, his frustration evident. "Michelle, he left you. He left all of this behind. And now you're letting him walk back into your life like nothing happened." "It's not that simple," Michelle replied, her voice rising slightly. "Isn't it?" Andrew countered, I've been here for you, for the boys. I've done everything I can to help, and now I feel like I'm being pushed aside because he suddenly decided to care. Michelle froze, his words striking a nerve. This isn't about you, Andrew, she said quietly. It's about my sons. If Keith can help me protect them from Kimberly, then I'll accept his help. That doesn't mean I trust him. Andrew's shoulders sagged slightly, his anger giving way to something more vulnerable. I care about you, Michelle. I care about Carl and Oliver, and I don't want to see you get hurt again. Michelle's expression softened. I know, and I appreciate everything you've done for us. But this is my fight, and I have to handle it the best way I can. Andrew nodded reluctantly, though his unease remained clear. Just be careful, okay? I will, Michelle promised, though a small part of her wondered if she could keep that promise. Kimberly Warburton prided herself on always being 3 steps ahead. Her meticulously planned schemes were designed to crush opposition before it even had a chance to resist. But for the first time in years, things weren't going according to plan. She sat in her expansive study, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows against the shelves of leather-bound books. The custody hearing had not gone as expected. Keith's public defiance had shaken her confidence, and the judge had requested additional time to deliberate on the matter. It wasn't a victory for Michelle, but it wasn't the decisive blow Kimberly had envisioned either. James, she called, her voice sharp. Her assistant entered, his usual stoic expression faltering as he took in the storm brewing behind Kimberly's composed facade. Yes, Mrs. Warburton. Explain to me how we're losing control of this situation, she demanded, her tone icy. The evidence we've presented should be enough to sway any judge in our favor. Yet here we are, stalled because my own son decided to turn against me. James cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. The judge seemed sympathetic to Ms. Jones's situation. The testimonies about her devotion to the children have painted her as a stable and loving parent, which complicates matters. Kimberly's nails tapped against the armrest of her chair. Sympathetic, she repeated bitterly. We don't need sympathy. We need results. There's also been chatter, James added reluctantly. Keith's decision to side with Ms. Jones has garnered public attention. People are questioning the motives behind our petition, particularly the claim about her unfit living conditions. Kimberly's lips thinned. Public opinion had never concerned her before, but she couldn't ignore the growing scrutiny. Enough excuses, she snapped. Find me something actionable, anything we can use to discredit her. I don't care how small it is. We need leverage. James hesitated, then nodded. I'll look into it. As James left, Kimberly stared into the flames, her mind racing. She would not lose this fight. The Warburton name demanded loyalty, control, and victory, and she would ensure it got all 3. Across town, Michelle sat at her dining table, sifting through the documents Laura had provided for the next phase of the custody battle. Each page felt heavier than the last, a reminder of how much was at stake. Keith arrived unannounced, carrying a manila folder. Michelle frowned as she opened the door, but before she could say anything, Keith held up the folder. I found something, he said. Michelle stepped aside, letting him in. What is it? Keith placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing copies of emails, financial reports, and legal documents. These are records of some of the tactics my mother has been using. She's been making donations to organizations connected to the judge and hiring private investigators to dig into your life. She's trying to influence the case. Michelle's stomach turned. How did you get these? I have contacts in her office, Keith admitted. People who don't agree with the way she operates. They were willing to help. Michelle stared at the documents, a mix of anger and exhaustion washing over her. This is illegal. She can't get away with this. She won't, Keith said firmly. I'm taking this to Laura. This could turn the tide in your favor. For the first time in days, Michelle felt a spark of hope. Kimberly sat in her study, reviewing her latest strategy when James returned, his expression uncharacteristically grim. Mrs. Warburton, he began carefully, there's something you should know. Some of your internal communications have been leaked. Kimberly froze. her gaze snapping to him. Leaked? Yes, James confirmed. It appears someone within your office has been passing information to Mr. Warburton. Kimberly's anger flared, her voice sharp. Though, we're still investigating, James said, his tone apologetic. But it's already reached Ms. Jones's legal team. If this is brought up in court, it could damage our case significantly. Kimberly's mind raced. She had always operated with precision and control, but this betrayal threatened to unravel everything. Find a leak, she said coldly, and deal with it, quietly. Meanwhile, Keith and Michelle met with Laura to discuss their next steps. The evidence Keith had provided was damning, and Laura wasted no time preparing to present it in court. This changes everything, Laura said, her eyes scanning the documents. If we can prove Kimberly's interference, it could discredit her entire case. Michelle glanced at Keith, her gratitude evident. Thank you for doing this. Keith nodded. I just want to make things right. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Michelle opened it to find Andrew standing there, his expression tense. I need to talk to you, he said, glancing at Keith. Michelle sighed. Andrew, now's not the time. Andrew's gaze hardened. You're trusting him? Andrew. No, Andrew interrupted, stepping inside. You're letting him waltz back into your life after everything he did. Don't you see what's happening? He's only here because of his mother. You think this is genuine? Keith stood, his expression calm but firm. I don't blame you for not trusting me, but I'm here to help Michelle and my sons. That's all. Andrew scoffed. And what happens when this is over? When you get bored or your mother comes up with a new scheme? Are you just going to disappear again? Andrew, Michelle said sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. That's enough. The room fell silent, the tension thick. Andrew sighed, his shoulders slumping. I just don't want you to get hurt. I can handle myself, Michelle said quietly. Kimberly Warburton was not used to losing. The leaked documents had sent shockwaves through her carefully constructed world, shaking her confidence for the first time in decades. Now, her once loyal circle of advisors was beginning to show cracks, with whispers of dissent and questions about her tactics growing louder. She stood at the head of the dining room table in the Warburton estate, facing a group of attorneys and advisors she had called for an emergency meeting. The grand room, usually a place of power and control, now felt suffocating. I want answers, Kimberly demanded, her voice cold. How did this happen? Who leaked those documents? The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, their silence only fueling her frustration. Finally, James cleared his throat. Mrs. Warburton, we believe the leak may have come from someone within the legal team or administrative staff, he said carefully. We're narrowing down the suspects, but the damage is already done. Kimberly's jaw tightened. Unacceptable. I don't pay for excuses. Fix this. Now. James hesitated before adding, there's something else. The court has been notified of the documents. The judge is considering reopening the investigation into your financial involvement with the case. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. Kimberly's grip on the back of her chair tightened, her nails digging into the fabric. Reopening the investigation. Yes, ma'am. If the court finds evidence of misconduct, it could weaken our position significantly. Kimberly waved her hand dismissively, though the tremor in her fingers betrayed her unease. Leave me, all of you. The advisors filed out of the room, their expressions guarded. When the doors closed, Kimberly sank into her chair, staring at the untouched tea in front of her. For the first time, she felt the weight of her unraveling empire pressing down on her shoulders. At Michelle's apartment, the atmosphere was no less tense. She sat at the dining table with Keith and Laura, the leaked documents spread out in front of them. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, but so was the growing pressure of the custody battle. This changes everything, Laura said, pointing to the key documents. The judge will have no choice but to take this into account. Kimberly's credibility is crumbling, and that gives us leverage. Michelle nodded, though the exhaustion was evident in her posture. She had been holding everything together for so long, and the constant stress was beginning to take its toll. Keith noticed her weariness and leaned forward. "You're doing great, Michelle," he said softly. "We're almost there." She met his gaze, her expression softening for a brief moment. "I just want this to be over. I want my boys to feel safe again." "They will," Keith promised. The doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. Michelle rose to answer it, her heart sinking when she saw Andrew standing on the other side. "Andrew," she said, her voice wary. "I need to talk to you," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His gaze fell on Keith and Laura, his jaw tightening. "I see you've got company." "Andrew, now's not the time," Michelle said, closing the door. "When is the time?" Andrew snapped, his frustration spilling over. "You've been shutting me out, Michelle. I've been here for you and the boys." And now he shows up and suddenly... "Andrew, stop," Michelle interrupted, her voice firm. "This isn't about you or Keith. This is about what's best for my boys. And you think he knows what's best?" Andrew shot back, glaring at Keith. Keith stood, his expression calm but resolute. "I understand why you're upset, Andrew. But this isn't about competition. It's about doing what's right for Carl and Oliver." "Easy for you to say," Andrew retorted. "You're the one who left." "Enough," Michelle said sharply, silencing both men. She looked at Andrew, her voice softening. "I appreciate everything you've done, but you have to trust me to make the right decisions." Andrew's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "I just don't want you to get hurt again." "I can handle myself," Michelle said gently. Andrew nodded reluctantly, then turned and left without another word. The tension lingered long after the door closed. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the final day of the custody hearing began. Reporters lined the hallways outside, their cameras flashing as the key players arrived. Inside, Michelle sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, Laura reviewed her notes, her confidence a steadying presence. Keith sat on Michelle's other side, his expression determined. Despite the tension between them, Michelle was grateful for his support. She knew she couldn't face this alone. Across the room, Kimberly sat with her legal team, her icy demeanor unshaken despite the recent setbacks. She glanced at Michelle with a look of disdain, as if to remind her of the power she still wielded. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began with closing arguments from both sides. Kimberly's attorney reiterated the Warburton family's ability to provide financial stability and opportunity for Carl and Oliver, portraying Michelle as a struggling single mother. Laura rose next, her voice calm but powerful. "Your Honor, my client has demonstrated time and time again that she is a capable and loving mother. While the Warburton family may have wealth, it is Michelle who has given these boys a home filled with love and stability. Money cannot replace a mother's devotion." The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. Then came the most anticipated moment, Keith's testimony. Keith took the stand, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "I've made mistakes," he began, his gaze briefly meeting Michelle's. "But the biggest mistake I ever made was walking away from Michelle and my sons. I can't undo the past, but I can stand here today and tell you that she is the best thing that ever happened to them. She's strong, she's dedicated, and she's the only person who truly deserves to raise Carl and Oliver." The courtroom was silent as Keith stepped down, his words hanging in the air. When the judge finally delivered his verdict, Michelle felt her breath catch. The court rules in favor of Michelle Jones retaining primary custody of Carl and Oliver Warburton. The petition for joint custody is denied. Relief washed over Michelle as she hugged her sons tightly, tears streaming down her face. Keith watched from a distance, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time, he felt like he had truly done something right. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the park as Carl and Oliver raced each other down a winding path, their energy seemingly endless. Michelle sat on a nearby bench, her eyes following her sons as they played. For the first time, in what felt like forever, a weight had been lifted from her chest. The courtroom battle was behind her, and she could finally focus on the future. Keith approached from a distance, carrying 2 ice cream cones, one in each hand. He had insisted on taking the boys out to celebrate, and Michelle had reluctantly agreed. Though she still had reservations about Keith's role in their lives, she couldn't deny the joy on her sons' faces whenever he was around. "Double chocolate, as requested," Keith said with a small smile as he handed one cone to Michelle. "Thanks," she said, her tone neutral but polite. He sat beside her, watching Carl and Oliver chase each other around a tree. "They're incredible," he said after a moment. Michelle nodded. "They are." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken words. Keith glanced at Michelle, his expression serious. "I want to thank you for letting me be here, for letting me try to be a part of their lives." Michelle turned to him, her gaze steady. "This isn't about you, Keith. It's about them. They deserve to have their father in their lives, but this isn't going to be easy. You can't just walk in and out whenever it suits you." "I know," Keith said quickly. "I won't. I've learned my lesson, Michelle. I'm here to stay." Her eyes searched his face, looking for any hint of insincerity. But for once, she saw none. "I hope so, for their sake." The boys ran up to them then, breathless and grinning. "Can we go to the swings?" Carl asked, his excitement palpable. "Go ahead," Michelle said, smiling despite herself. As the boys ran off, Keith leaned back on the bench, his expression contemplative. "I never realized how much I was missing until now," he admitted. Michelle glanced at him, her defenses softening slightly. "You still have a lot to make up for." "I know," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The weeks following the custody hearing brought a sense of normalcy Michelle hadn't felt in years. The cafe was bustling with regulars and new customers alike. Her boys were thriving in school, and the shadow of Kimberly Warburton seemed to have faded, at least for now. Keith had been true to his word. He showed up consistently, spending time with Carl and Oliver and slowly rebuilding their trust. While Michelle remained cautious, she couldn't deny the effort he was putting in. One evening, after closing the cafe, Michelle sat at one of the tables, going over paperwork. She didn't hear Keith enter until he spoke. "Burning the midnight oil." Michelle looked up, startled. "Keith, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk," he said, sitting across from her. Michelle sighed, setting her pen down. "What is it?" Keith hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us, about the boys, about what I've done. And I need you to know how sorry I am." "Keith, please let me finish," he said, his voice earnest. "I walked away because I was scared. Scared of failing, scared of not living up to my family's expectations. But I know now that I made the wrong choice, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Michelle's expression softened, though she didn't speak. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Keith continued, "but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you, and to Carl and Oliver, that I mean it." Michelle studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "Actions speak louder than words, Keith. And so far, you've been showing up. That's a good start. But trust isn't rebuilt overnight." "I know," he said quietly. "Good," Michelle said, standing and gathering her things. "Because this isn't just about you or me. It's about them." Keith nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand, and I'm ready for that." As Michelle locked the cafe door and stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The Warburton estate was unusually quiet. The grand halls, once bustling with staff and filled with echoes of Kimberly's commanding presence, now felt cold and empty. Kimberly sat in her private study, staring at the same family portrait she had gazed at countless times before. But tonight, the faces staring back at her felt distant, almost unrecognizable. The fallout from the custody battle had left its mark. Public scrutiny of her tactics had tarnished her pristine reputation, and Keith's defiance had driven a wedge between them that seemed impossible to repair. For the first time in years, Kimberly found herself truly alone. She swirled the amber liquid in her glass, her thoughts circling like vultures. She had always believed she was acting in the best interest of the family, that her relentless pursuit of control was necessary to maintain their legacy. But now, even she couldn't ignore the cracks forming in the foundation she had built. James entered the room quietly, holding a folder. Kimberly didn't look up. "Mrs. Warburton," he began cautiously, "I thought you should know that Keith has formally requested to relinquish his ties to the Warburton estate." Kimberly's hand froze mid-motion. She slowly turned to face him, her expression icy. "He's severing his ties." "Yes, ma'am," James confirmed. "He's transferring his shares and stepping away from all responsibilities related to the estate." Kimberly's jaw tightened. "He's throwing everything away for her?" James hesitated before replying. "It appears he's choosing a different path, one focused on his family." Kimberly's chest tightened. She had always assumed Keith would come back to her, that he would see reason and return to the life he was meant to lead. But now, it seemed, she had lost him for good. "Leave me," she said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual sharpness. James bowed his head and exited, leaving Kimberly alone with her thoughts. She stared out the window, the distant city lights twinkling like stars. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her choices. Across town, Michelle stood in her small living room, sorting through a box of keepsakes. The boys had finally gone to bed, their laughter still echoing in her ears as she sifted through old photos and trinkets. Keith had joined him for dinner earlier that evening, and while things were far from perfect, Michelle could see the effort he was making. It was a delicate balance, allowing him into their lives while protecting the stability she had fought so hard to build. She pulled out a photo of her younger self with Keith, taken during happier times. They were smiling, their faces lit with the glow of sunset. It felt like a lifetime ago. A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly set the photo aside. When she opened the door, Keith stood there, his expression uncertain. "Sorry to drop by so late," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I needed to talk." Michelle stepped aside, letting him in. "What's on your mind?" Keith hesitated, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "I wanted to let you know that I've cut ties with my mother. With the estate, the business, everything." Michelle blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. "Why?" "Because none of it matters," he said simply. "Not compared to you and the boys. I've spent too much of my life trying to live up to expectations that never made me happy. I'm done with that." Michelle studied him, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, but years of hurt and disappointment made it hard to trust. "You're really serious about this," she said softly. Keith nodded. "I am, and I know I have a long way to go to earn your trust, but I'm not giving up." Michelle's lips curved into a small smile. "It's a start." The park was bustling with activity as families gathered for a weekend picnic. Balloons bobbed in a breeze, children's laughter filled the air, and the smell of grilled food wafted through the crowd. Michelle sat on a blanket under a shady tree, watching as Carl and Oliver played tag with a group of kids. Keith sat beside her, his sleeves rolled up and a relaxed smile on his face. "You know," Michelle said, breaking the comfortable silence, "if you had told me a year ago that we'd be sitting here like this, I wouldn't have believed you." Keith chuckled. "I wouldn't have believed it either." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Finally, Keith turned to her, his expression serious. "I know I've said this before, but thank you," he said, "for giving me a chance, for letting me be part of their lives, and yours." Michelle looked at him, her heart softening. "It wasn't easy, and it's still not easy, but you're proving yourself, Keith. That means something." The boys ran up to them then, their faces flushed with excitement. "Can we get ice cream?" Oliver asked, tugging on Keith's arm. "Sure," Keith said, standing and taking Carl and Oliver's hands. "Let's go." Michelle watched them walk away, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in years, she felt like things were finally falling into place. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Painting the park in warm hues, Michelle joined them at the ice cream stand. They laughed and talked, the past fading into the background as they focused on the present and the future they were building together. A special request for our amazing viewers. Thank you so much for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support helps us create more heartwarming and inspiring content just for you. What part of the story had the most impact on you? Was it the emotional courtroom battle, Keith's redemption arc, or Michelle's unwavering determination? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have an idea for a story? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Whether it's a tale of love, redemption, betrayal, or triumph, we're always looking for inspiring ideas to bring to life. Your input means a world to us, and who knows? Your idea could become our next big story. Thank you for being part of our storytelling journey. Your engagement and creativity are what make this channel special. See you in the next story.